Mark 15, verses 16 through 21 say, "The soldiers took Jesus into the courtyard of the governor's headquarters and called out the entire regiment. They dressed him in a purple robe, and they wove thorn crown branches into a crown and put it on his head. Then they saluted him and taunted, 'Hail, King of the Jews!' And they struck him on the head with a reed stick and spit on him, and dropped to their knees in mock worship. When they were finally tired of mocking him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him again, and then they led him away to be crucified. A passerby named Simon, who was from Cyrene, was coming in from the countryside just then, and the soldiers forced him to carry Jesus' cross. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
They pressed into service a passerby coming from the country, Simon of Cyrene, to bear his cross. This verse and its parallels in the other Gospels are all we know of this man. The rest is left to our imagination. Who was Simon of Cyrene? What was he like? What was he about? What was his character? We don't know. He's about as fringe and peripheral a character as you could ever find in any story. If the Gospel of Mark was a play, the role of Simon of Cyrene would be considered an extra played by some startup actor. This is the only time he shows up. He's just passing by that way on the day when the skies grew pitch black dark at noon and the angels held their breath and covered their eyes. He just happened to show up just then. Simon was passing by on the day when history hung in the balance, or maybe some eternity hung in the balance. He didn't know it in that moment. He couldn't know it in that moment. In fact, I wonder what Simon of Cyrene woke up thinking that day when he carried the cross. He had come in from the country, no doubt as a diasporitic Jew, to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. But in that crowd, they picked Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross because Jesus by then was too weak. And that's all we know, one verse. It makes you wonder why we know this part of the story at all. If that's all we know about him, why even include that one verse? Why tell us that? Some scholars suggest that Mark is comparing Simon of Cyrene to that other Simon. You remember him, don't you? Simon Peter. The one who, when Jesus said, "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter said, "You are the Christ." And he was the first one in the story to say that out loud. He got it. You're the Christ. But no sooner did he make that confession than Jesus began teaching that he would suffer and die. And Simon Peter took Jesus aside and rebuked him. Can you imagine? In one side of his mouth, he's saying, "You're the Christ." And on the other side, out of the other side of his mouth, he's rebuking Jesus. You need some education on what it means to be a Messiah. The Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the King, doesn't suffer. The King inflicts suffering. The Christ doesn't die. The Christ kills. Simon thought Jesus needed to be educated. But then Jesus responds by rebuking Simon Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Wow. He confessed rightly. And here Jesus is saying, "Satan, for you have in mind humanity's concerns, not God's." And then Jesus said, "If anyone wishes to come after me," the text that was just read, "he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." When Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me," I have no doubt that everyone in the crowd that day knew what he was talking about, because everyone in the crowd had seen one. The Romans crucified people in mass, time after time after time, and they put them on major thoroughfares. Everyone knew what Jesus meant when he said, "Take up your cross." But when it was time for Jesus to take up his cross, Simon Peter was nowhere to be found. But this Simon, the other Simon, Simon of Cyrene, actually helped Jesus carry his cross. He says nothing with his mouth. His confession comes with his back, I guess. And while Simon Peter ran from the cross, Simon of Cyrene helped bear it. And in this way, Simon of Cyrene models what Jesus is saying here. He took up the cross and he followed Jesus. Maybe that's why Mark tells us of him, because this is what a disciple looks like. Others say that Simon and his sons became key leaders in the early church. In some of the early manuscripts in this story in Mark, it says that Simon of Cyrene, the father of Rufus and Alexander, Mark tells us who Simon's sons are. Scholars think the Gospel of Mark was written from Rome. In Paul's letter to the Romans, in chapter 16, verse 13, Paul greets Rufus and his mother, indicating that they were key leaders in that church. Could this be the same Rufus? Is this Simon of Cyrene's son leading the early church? We don't know. Some people think, though, that Mark includes Simon because he and his family became stalwart pillars in the early church in Rome. And still others believe that Simon is mentioned as an illustration that sometimes your cross finds you more than you find it. I mean, Simon was just an unsuspecting passerby that day. He didn't seek this. He didn't ask for this. It was placed upon him. Sometimes the burden of one's calling finds that person. One day of volunteering at a homeless shelter leads to volunteering at the homeless shelter, which leads to relationships with homeless people, and pretty soon that person is running the homeless shelter. But the cross found them more than they found it. Or the doctor says to a husband and wife, she looks at the wife and says, "I'm sorry to tell you this, but you have cancer." And over the next couple of years, they both have crosses of their own to carry. Sometimes you find your cross, and sometimes your cross finds you. Maybe that's why Simon of Cyrene is known as the patron saint of the passerby. He knew what it was like. Others think we know of Simon to show us how minor characters can play major roles. This is the only time he shows up. But what a time to show up. We only know him from this one verse, but in this one verse, he does something that no one else in all of human history did. He helped Jesus carry his cross. Sometimes, brothers and sisters, those who have altered history were standing on the fringes of it. Sometimes the brightest lights shine from those who are standing outside of the spotlight. Sometimes the minor characters change the story in a major way. Maybe Simon of Cyrene should be known as the patron saint of the peripheral people. I don't know. But there is one more thing about Simon that speaks to us loudly and clearly today, or at least it should. And it has to do with where Simon was from. Cyrene. Cyrene was a coastal city in northern Africa, where northern Africa butts up against the Mediterranean Sea in what is today the country of Libya. Simon was an African. Did you know that? Simon of Cyrene was a black man. Unnoticed by many, this part of the story, especially in the white church. This hasn't been told. But in the African American church, there is an entire tradition that grows from this man, Simon of Cyrene. I didn't know about this until a few years ago when I was reading a book by James Cone. He was one of the leading theologians of the 20th century. He taught at Union Seminary in New York City, but he grew up in Arkansas. And he studied right across the river at Shorter College, this amazing theologian. He wrote a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And in this book, he draws clear parallels between how crucifixion worked in the Roman world and how lynching worked in the Deep South in his day. It wasn't just about putting somebody to death. You could do that in more efficient ways than a crucifixion and a lynching tree. It wasn't just about putting someone to death. It was a visible manifestation of power. It was to say, we're up here and you're down here, so don't mess with us. It was an attempt at lending evidence to fear and putting someone's shame on display. The cross and the lynching tree were meant to dehumanize, to destroy, to suppress, oppress. And if the cross and the lynching tree were paralleled, Cone says, then Simon of Cyrene wasn't just one historical person, but was emblematic of a people who bore the cross of Jesus, and he with them. In 1925, the famed African-American poet Countee Cullen wrote a poem entitled Simon the Cyrenian Speaks. Here it goes. He never spoke a word to me, and yet he called my name. He never gave a sign to me, and yet I knew and came. At first I said, I will not bear his cross upon my back. He only seeks to put it there because my skin is black. But he was dying for a dream, and he was very meek. And in his eyes there shone a gleam men journey far to seek. It was himself my pity bought, I did for Christ alone. What all of Rome could not have wrought with bruise of lash or stone. In 1917, a one-play act entitled Simon the Cyrenian opened on Broadway, and people all over New York City flocked. It became a cultural craze. It was powerful. And it was powerful because for the first time on Broadway, black actors and actresses were playing these roles, not the blackface caricatures which were so common in those days. And it impacted people. It moved them. And then in 1965, a movie was released, The Greatest Story Ever Told. Some of you might have seen it. In that movie, Simon of Cyrene was portrayed by Sidney Poitier, further strengthening this tradition and putting it in the consciousness of the black church. Yet I don't remember hearing one sermon on the Black Simon, as they called him. But it's something we should recover, and it's something we should recover yesterday, because we need to know this part of the story. Brothers and sisters, I'm sure I don't have to tell you this today, but white nationalism is on the rise in this country. You heard, I'm sure, the New York Times report on February 12th that federal prosecutors in Arkansas charged 54 men with racketeering charges who were part of a white supremacist gang in the Arkansas River Valley. Their name was the New Aryan Empire. There were charges of violence, conspiracy to commit murder, and kidnapping were on the list of charges. I read the article in February and I thought, this is going somewhere, and I haven't heard a word about it since. 54 men. The authorities seized 25 pounds of meth, 69 firearms, and $70,000 in drug proceeds. And all of this happened in February in Russellville. And I say to you, these attitudes are on the rise, and they're out in the open, and they're spreading in our culture today. Simon of Cyrene is still carrying his cross. And with the passing of every minute, it becomes more and more clear that the murderer, the terrorist in New Zealand on Friday, was someone who had been steeped in white nationalist thought. It had rewired his brain. It had shaped his neural grooves so that he thought that white people were superior to people of color. Which is why he had no problem walking into that mosque and doing what he did. Simon of Cyrene is still carrying his cross. But much of the burden of that cross isn't so brash and overt. Much of the burden of that cross is more covert and ingrained. It's 100,000 small degradations and centuries of policy and procedure. And history that we haven't been the most honest about. We haven't told the full truth of. In this country, racism wasn't just the sinful attitudes of a few bad apples. It was ingrained in the seed that was planted that produced the seed of our political apparatus. Racism wasn't a glitch in our system. It was ingrained in the system. I know, brothers and sisters, that I talk a good deal about race from this pulpit, and some might think a bit too much. Can I pause for a moment, pastor to people, and tell you why? I believe that the gospel impacts the most personal parts of who we are today. I also believe the gospel and talk of kingdoms involves social uplift. It involves systems and streets and societies, not just souls. For instance, when Jesus in Nazareth in his very first sermon, which set the stage for everything he did in Luke, when he stood up and said, read from Isaiah, preaching good news to the poor, recovery of sight to the blind, to set the prisoners free, I think he meant poor, blind, and free, or poor, blind, and imprisoned. I think Jesus cared about those things. Race is not the only thing I care about. I care about cyclical poverty. I care about generational poverty. I care about what keeps people stuck in those cycles that they cannot get out of. And there are no easy answers to that question, but I will say when you dig and dig and dig and dig and get to the core of it, somewhere very near the core of that in our culture, there is race. Why is it that every city you go to, when you go to the poor side of town, you go to the colored side of town? Why is that? I care about the education of children. A good education. Solid education. When you study the criteria by which we call good schools good and bad schools bad, and you dig and dig and dig and dig and get down to the core of that, very near the core of that, you come to race. I care about criminal justice, that our systems are fair and equitable and do what we say that they are to do. But when you study who is in prison today, and for what, and for how long, and then study who isn't in prison today for even higher crimes, you are talking about race. Did you know that there are more black men in prison in this country today than were enslaved at the beginning of the Civil War? What does that mean for us? I care about access to quality health care. Who has it and who doesn't have it? When you dig and dig and dig and dig and get down to the substance of that, the marrow of that, you are talking about race, brothers and sisters. At what point would we as people of goodwill, people who want to be wise in these times and in this place, people who strive for truth at its deepest levels, why would we not at some point pump the brakes and say, it seems like race is at the core of a lot of this stuff. Maybe if we're not talking about race, we're not talking about it. Whatever it is. And when you combine this structural racism with this cultural myth in America that we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, it becomes a toxic stew of ideology. Because then we say to the poor folks and the uneducated folks and the sick folks, what's wrong with you? Pull yourself up. Think about that phrase for a second. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Do you know that cannot be done? It is a physical impossibility to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. You need someone else to do that. There's some history there. Do some research on that phrase. Brothers and sisters, I'm saying to you today, if we're not talking about race and the way it has shaped everything in our society, then we are not talking about it, whatever the it is. And while no one in this room is guilty of the sins of our past, we are all and one responsible for the redemption of our future, and that begins by telling the truth, even if it's a hard truth. Did you know that on May 29th, 1902, this congregation expelled a man? Did you know that? It's part of our history we don't talk about very often, but maybe we should. On March 29th, 1902, we kicked a man out of this church. He was, on that day, the 20th governor of the state of Arkansas. On May 29th, 1902, we kicked the governor of Arkansas out of our church. He had been governor since the election of 1900. His name was Jeff Davis. And if you drew conclusions about him based upon his name, you're probably right about him. These were the days of the rise of the KKK. Reconstruction was over, and so the KKK was filling that void. The myth of the lost cause of the Confederacy was growing and spreading, and Jeff Davis rode that wave into political office. In 1896, he became the Attorney General of the state of Arkansas, and that year he helped campaign for William Jennings Bryan for president, if that tells you more about him. In 1900, he won the governor's race on a platform of staunch segregation, a crackdown on crime, which really meant a crackdown on black crime. He was a proponent of convict leasing, which was slavery by another name, right? And in 1905, when President Theodore Roosevelt came to Arkansas, the first president since the Civil War to come to our state, Jeff Davis as governor hosted him. Theodore Roosevelt had had Booker T. Washington to the White House in 1901, remember? And Jeff Davis gave a speech before Rockefeller spoke. Not Rockefeller. Who'd I say? Roosevelt. Different Arkansas family. And in that speech, right in front of Theodore Roosevelt, Jeff Davis made a moral argument for lynchings as social control. It angered Roosevelt incredibly, and he refused to come back as long as Davis was our governor. In the 1904 re-election campaign, Davis harangued his political opponent, who was a Supreme Court judge named Carroll Wood, also a member of this church, because he had hired a black man as jury commissioner. And Jeff Davis said, and I quote, "No man will be hired in my administration unless he is a white man and a Democrat and a Jeff Davis man," unquote. But none of that was the reason he was expelled from this church. In 1902, there was an ongoing conflict between Jeff Davis, who was a deacon here, and James P. Eagle, who was a deacon here, who had also been a governor of this state from 1888 to 1892. And at one point, Eagle and Davis were political allies. In fact, Davis appointed Eagle to the Capitol Commission. They were thinking about whether to move the Capitol from where it used to be to where it currently is. And Eagle wanted one thing and Davis wanted another, and they began a separate political trajectory. In multiple political races, they supported opposing candidates, and they became enemies, political enemies. And they're both deacons here in this church. James P. Eagle at that time was the president of the Arkansas Baptist State Convention. And Jeff Davis gave him a really hard time because Jeff Davis was known to be a public drunkard. He was. He drank everywhere he went. He would openly brag and say that he could get drunk on Saturday nights and come to church on Sunday morning and say, "Amen, amen," and everything would be okay. This was his public behavior all over the state. Until one time he went to Van Buren and he got drunk, and a preacher in Van Buren called him out on it. He's the governor, remember. A Methodist preacher here in Little Rock called him out on it. And James P. Eagle and the other deacons in this church said, we probably should do something about this. And so on May 29th, 1902, Second Baptist kicked Governor Jeff Davis out of this church. A newspaper in Hope said, "It's a pity the state cannot get rid of him, and with as little harm to itself as that Baptist church." And Davis responded and said, "I'm a pint Baptist, but Second Baptist is full of court Baptists." Come on, that's laugh word. That's good stuff right there. Did y'all know we're court Baptists? But I tell you that story today to tell you that we kicked Jeff Davis out of this church because of the dissonance between his public drinking and his profession of faith. But we did not kick him out of this church because of the dissonance between his profession of faith and his public policy. We did not kick him out of this church because of his openly virulent racist views. It's just how it was in those days. I know it and you know it. It's just how it was. But can I ask you this morning, what caused more hurt and pain? Jeff Davis's drinking or Jeff Davis's policies? And that's where we have work to do, brothers and sisters. We are the Church of Brooks Hayes. Thanks be to God, I wear that like a badge. We are the Church of Brooks Hayes. But a little over a century ago, we were also the Church of Jeff Davis. And we need to own that too. And the need for our day is not just churches who say, we're not racist, but churches that actively oppose racism in all of its forms. Its violence, its arrogance, its ignorance, its policies, its procedures, all of it. Simon of Cyrene didn't just stand there with hands up saying, I'm not crucifying him, I'm not crucifying him. When the cross came his way, Simon of Cyrene carried it. So should we. The need for our day isn't color blindness, but colorfulness. I hear people, I believe them to be of goodwill, say, I'm colorblind. God doesn't see color, I don't see color. I believe they mean that genuinely. A few weeks ago, I heard a speaker say, what if we said, I don't see physical handicap. God looks at their soul, I look at their soul. I don't see physical handicap. It would make me feel better. It would remove a burden from me, but it doesn't help that person anymore. Hear that analogy. I'm not saying black folks are handicapped, but I am saying that colorblindness, saying we're colorblind, helps us feel better, but it doesn't help them. And God doesn't seem to be a colorblind God. God seems to be a colorful God. And He likes it that way. Maybe we should too. The need for our day is to recognize how race has shaped us in all of these ways. We need to be honest about the long centuries that led us to this day and the deep but hard work, the soul work and the street work, which must lead us from this day. We must read our history from the back of the bus, not the front of it. Because the front of the bus cannot see everything like the back of the bus can. We must confess the gravity of pain and anguish that occurs when a justice system is inherently unjust. And we must be honest about the fact that in this country, white nationalism and the gospel of Jesus Christ became so intertwined that people could not tell them apart. And today, when you begin to untwine them, people start thinking you're preaching some other gospel because they've never heard this sort of thing before. We can't just be opposed to the lynching tree in its various forms. We must be willing to take up our cross and follow Jesus, actively bearing the pain and the responsibility and the burden of that ourselves. This is our cross today. One of them at least. And even if we didn't choose this cross is choosing us. And it's so very tempting for all of us to just say, I was just passing by. I just want to live my life quietly. And truth be told, today, you can say that. I can say that if we're white. But Simon was not just a passerby. Neither should we be. Brothers and sisters, we are not just called to be on the right side of history. We are not just called to be on the right side of the cross. We're called to be people who pick it up, to join Jesus in the act of redemption and justice. I guess what I'm trying to say to you today is, maybe one of the most faithful and powerful ways that we can help Jesus carry His cross today is if we help Simon, the black Simon, carry his. Must Jesus bear the cross alone? Must Simon? Let's pray. Oh Lord, we long to be free, really free, actually free. And we know the truth is the only thing that will make us such. So help us to tell the truth in love. Help us to embody your way in this world. And whenever the cross comes our way, and however it comes our way, and whomever might be bearing it when it comes our way, help us to take it up and follow you. Help us to tell the truth. Help us to live the truth and bear good news of great joy, which really is for all people. And all God's people said,